So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dia Cirillo, and I'm staffing one of the staff with the Policing Policy Commission. I want to welcome you to the Brown Bag Lunch on Building Justice in the Justice System, Trauma-Informed Law Enforcement. Today we have two presenters, Jennifer Drake Croft and Judge Sheila Calloway. I'm going to introduce them in a second. Unfortunately, Margie Quinn is down and out due to health circumstances. So we wish her well and look forward to hearing from her soon. But I'm very excited about this panel. At long last, we get to turn our attention to what it means to be trauma-informed. So I'd like to introduce our speakers. Jen Drake Croft, who's up first, is the Director of Child Wellbeing with the Tennessee Commission on Children and Youth. Sitting on multiple state and local committees, Jennifer has helped lead and shape macro-level initiatives and policies to promote healthy child development, prevent adverse childhood experiences, and support resilient communities. You know, at the end of the day, trauma-informed approaches are really about supporting resilient communities. And I think that's a really important nugget to take away from today's discussion is how do we build a resilient community in Nashville? Most notably, Jen was a founding member of All Children Excel, ACE Nashville, a 400-member collective impact initiative seeking to reduce ACEs and promote resiliency at the population level using a public health approach. Jen has many accolades to her name. She is a seasoned public policy professional. And I've learned a fun fact about Jen. When she's not out there creating systems change in our world today, she occasionally kicks back and watches Real Housewives. So we all need to decompress. After Jen, we will hear from Honorable Judge Sheila Calloway. Sheila is a native of Louisville, Kentucky, and came to Tennessee in 1987. In 2014, she was elected to the juvenile court judge. She serves as an adjunct professor at Vanderbilt University Law School, Belmont Law School, and American Baptist College. Judge Calloway also serves on the Mayor's Behavioral Health and Wellness Advisory Council, and we were just on a meeting today together. That council is in the process of putting together some recommendations for the commission to consider. I've also learned a couple of an interesting fun fact about Judge Calloway. And given her numerous activities and roles that she carries out across Metro Nashville, she does occasionally get to take a moment to cool her heels as well. And her show is really Young and the Restless. And this is something that I love about these women. They can carry the mantle on some really powerful stuff, but at the end of the day, boy, they're really fun to hang out with too. So without further ado, I'm going to cede the floor to Jen Drake Croft to take us off. Thank you.
All right, wonderful. Let me share my screen here. And let me go back to the beginning of the presentation. We flipped through it at the beginning, and this is what I get for trying to be prepared. All right, good deal. Well, as she said, my name is Jen Drake Croft, and I'm super excited to be with you all here today. And I do believe in watching some really dumb TV on a nightly basis. When we all do the work that we do, we need an opportunity to really take a break, and be ready to do it again in the next day. So many of you are probably familiar with adverse childhood experience and ACEs, and I want to say that I have a lot of slides in this deck in a very short amount of time. They're mostly visual cues, and I will be sharing this deck with you via a PDF version that Dia will send out. So as I'm flipping through, don't worry, you will have it. It's really just to make sure that we're all on the same page, all on the same foundation as to why we are talking about this in this forum. So really quickly, most of you are familiar that healthy child development is the foundation for educational achievement, economic productivity, responsible citizenship, and lifelong health. And these pillars really lead successful parenting in the next generation. which ultimately supports strong communities and healthy economies. So when we get it right the first time, we support wellness and prosperity for our entire community. One thing that people are less familiar with is the rapid development that occurs in terms of brain development in the earliest years of life. So in the first 3 years of life, we know that 1 million new neural connections are being formed every single second, and that this really is comparable to the building of a house or the building of a skyscraper or what have you, right? That we have to have a really good foundation and that things happen in a sequential order from the most basic skills with more complex skills building on top of them. So it's really important that we give children, youth, and young adults opportunities to build strong neural pathways and strong brain architecture to support all future learning behavior and health. Bill Gates says that what happens in the first 2 months of life has so much to do with how the next 80 years turn out. And that is incredibly true. And it's unfortunate that that's not common knowledge, but working to make it common knowledge, because not only is it important for the policy that we put in place today with children and youth, it's also important when we are working with adults and understanding the behaviors that we're seeing and understanding paths to health and healing. So I'm going to give a quick definition of trauma. This is from SAMHSA. And so trauma refers to the experiences that cause intense physical and psychological stress reactions. Trauma results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So I want to make sure that we are operating from the same definition. Why is this? Why is it that the experiences that we have, good or bad, growing up, particularly in the earliest years of life, have such lasting effects? It really goes back to that definition that SAMHSA laid out, that it is causing biological changes in the developing brain and body that set the stage for either positive health outcomes or negative health outcomes, and not just physical health, but emotional health, social health, et cetera, relational health, et cetera. So we're going to quickly go through different types of stress, right? Not all stress is bad. In fact, some stress for kids is healthy for brain development, but where it gets problematic is when we're talking about toxic levels of stress. This is ongoing, repeated exposure to abuse, neglect, community violence, any source of stress that is above average. It's not trying out for the soccer team, for example. And often it's toxic because these children and youth do not have the presence of safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments that buffer the effects of this experience. So they don't have anybody in their corner that are telling them, this is how we're going to get through this. You're going to be safe. You're okay. I've got your back, sort of thing. And a lot of people, unfortunately, experience toxic stress, and it shows up in many of the problems that we see societally here in Nashville and across the United States. When we think about what's actually happening, when we talk about brain architecture and the ways in which these experiences change the developing brain, this is a really great visual. What you see on your left is the brain of a healthy, nurtured 3-year-old child. And on your right, you see the brain child who was raised in a Romanian orphanage and experienced a lot of neglect. And you can see that there are stark differences between these two PET scans. Particularly, they are pointing out the temporal lobes here, right, which are responsible for regulating emotions, receiving input from senses, and they help with, or they lead, when you don't have these skills or you don't have this brain architecture, it leads to emotional and cognitive difficulties later in life. The good news is I'm giving you all the bad news at the beginning, but I'm going to get to resilience and what we can actually do about it by the end of this presentation. So for those of you who have heard about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, it was conducted roughly 25 years ago at this point, was done with a huge sample size, members who were affiliated with Kaiser Permanente in San Diego. And it was a joint effort by Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Essentially, this study started because you had two physicians who were noticing a relationship between people's reported history of childhood trauma and the development of health behaviors later on, right? So they developed a 10-question questionnaire, which they administered to these 17,000 individuals. And they included these 10 categories, for lack of a better word: 5 types of abuse and neglect, and 5 types of household dysfunction. For every experience you had, you put, a check mark. And at the end of the day, you had a score between 0 and 10. Either you'd experienced all 10 of these, or you experienced something in between, right? And there are lots of people who have an ACE score of 0 that have never experienced any of these. When they compared ACE scores at the population level with medical records, health data, what they found was a graded dose response relationship. Meaning, in layman's terms, the more ACEs you had, the greater your risk for developing 9 out of 10 of our leading diseases, really developing mental health issues, substance abuse issues, and also experiencing social problems, involvement with the justice system, et cetera. So we see that, a child that maybe experiences 1 or 2 ACEs, particularly when they have those safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments, we're not saying that those folks are going to die earlier or develop heart disease, right? But what we're saying is that we see a trend that with 4 or more ACEs, we see lots of these poor health outcomes. And it helps us understand that this is the root cause behind a lot of the things that we are tackling as a society, and that we spend millions of dollars, really billions of dollars, and millions of hours trying to address. One thing that might stand out to you all when you looked at those 10 ACEs is the fact that there are other types of stress that kids experience. And this study has been replicated in many states, including Tennessee, and in many communities over the last 2 decades. And we've seen the exact same patterns and results at the population level. I need to point out that the ACE questionnaire is not a diagnostic tool at an individual level. It really is looking at what are the trends when you're looking at an entire state or an entire community, right? And so you had folks in Philadelphia who looked at that original study. They noted the fact that the participants in that study were mostly white, mostly middle class, and mostly had some level of college education, and did not reflect the demographics of the Philadelphia community, right? That were more social and socially and economically diverse than that original population. So also I'm stumbling over my words because I am trying to rush through these slides to make sure I get everything in. So I apologize for that. So they included these additional or expanded adverse childhood experiences, tested them to see if they had the same impact, and lo and behold, they did. So things like witnessing violence, living in unsafe neighborhoods, experiencing racism, living in foster care, and experiencing bullying. I expect that as this research continues, right, as the science evolves, we'll see even more added to this list. But this probably doesn't surprise you that these things too create toxic stress, or potentially create toxic stress, especially when you're stacking them up. All right. So one thing that we have to consider when we're thinking about these expanded ACEs are like social determinants of health, and our history and the impact of policy that have happened over the last 200 years especially, right? And the way in which that shows up in the health and well-being and the lived environment of lots of families today. A lot of times when you think about the combination of adverse childhood experiences and also living in a community that has a that has decreased access to resources, that has lots of violence, that includes poverty, or even includes things like unsafe drinking water, right, or mold in your household. These things not only increase the prevalence of adverse childhood experiences, but they create complex trauma. And for lots of Nashvillians, that is what we're seeing, right? So we know that ACEs are common among every demographic, right? Every race. And we see that show up in Tennessee, but we have to have a special lens with folks that are experiencing these additional barriers, these additional stressors that create this toxic more toxic stress in the brains and bodies of children growing up in our city. Very quickly, just to bring this close to home, in 2017, through the Burfus survey, we saw that 61% of Tennesseans had at least one adverse childhood experience, and 28% had 3 or more ACEs. And we know that this is an underreport because these are cold call telephone calls. So you can assume that the rates are actually higher, but this is pretty astounding and lets us know that 1 in 4 Tennesseans has a higher ACE score. Again, because of the relationship between lived environment where we, work, learn, play, etc., and ACEs, we have to think of a holistic, comprehensive approach when we are attempting to move the needle and improve outcomes for people in our city. So what you'll see here is you see that we have those systems that are addressing adverse childhood experiences, but we also have many systems that we can affect that also they contribute to ACEs, but they're called adverse community environments. And here you will see community policing and those kinds of things that we're attempting to address through this group and others as being a key part of the solution to improving health and resilience in our community. And it's going to take collective ingenuity, but good thing we got a lot of smart people in Nashville with a lot of collective wisdom. This is figure outable. So I lay all that context out because I believe deeply in starting with why, right? I don't think that we get into the policy recommendations or the how-tos without saying why we're doing it. And oftentimes we miss that step. And when people begin to understand that the adults that they're working with that have very challenging behaviors, that they have had a lifetime of trauma that's affected their brains and bodies, then we start to think differently about the way that we interact with those adults. Same with children, right? And so I'm a part of something very exciting that Judge Calloway is also a part of, which is called Building Strong Brains Tennessee. And understanding this work has led to this mission of attempting to change the culture in our state so that the state's overarching philosophy, policies, programs, and practices for children, youth, and young adults use the latest brain science to prevent and mitigate the impact of adverse childhood experiences. Because this is one of the largest public health problems we grapple with, you don't solve this just by engaging people like me, right? Or engaging social workers or counselors. You have to engage people at every single level. And so you see here that is our goal and what we have been successful in doing in the last 5 years. We have something that we call the 4 Ps that we want to engage all of these different sectors and communities in, which is changing your philosophy and approach, changing policies and funding, programs and services, and professional practice to align with this science so that we can more effectively realize our mission, whatever our mission is, right? And create health and wellness for everybody and understand that all of these systems really do affect one another, right? And affect lots of different communities, and that we have to come together with this common understanding in order to comprehensively change what needs to be changed. So one thing that we've done, I'm really, this could be a 5-hour presentation on building strong brains. There's a lot of work, and I'm more than happy to answer questions offline. You can email me if you want to know more. But one thing that we've done is we have done an extensive training for trainers effort. We have lots of building strong brains trainers in Nashville, and essentially we have recruited people from all parts of the state and all professions to understand and be able to present to others on these concepts of early brain development, of toxic stress, and strategies to build resilience. Because the reality is that resilience is something that can be built at any point across the lifespan. While it is easier to build it in young children and adolescents, we can still build it in adults. And of course, it has this extended benefit of benefiting the children in their lives that they're raising and interacting with, right? And so I like to give the example of a training for trainers we did in Chattanooga, where we had the chief medical officer of the Children's Hospital and the police chief, Chief Roddy, as well as those teachers, counselors, nonprofit folks, advocates, all in the same room, learning the same thing and then working off the same page, right? And so we've seen that throughout the state. We have over 1,000 diverse sector trainers, and they've presented to over 62,000 Tennesseans, representing more counties should be filled in now, but representing all 95 counties of Tennessee. And so another thing that Building Strong Brains has done, in addition to empowering people with awareness, which is step one, is we are also then really trying to change systems. And one way in which we do that is through ACES Innovation Grant. So our Governor Haslam appropriated $1.25 million to ACES Innovation Grants about 4 years ago. As he was finishing his second term, he increased it to $2.45 million and put it into recurring funds. Unsure how COVID will affect that, but it has had a really massive effect in our state and made many organizations and institutions national models of how you do this work, including the work of Metro Nashville Public Schools that has had incredible success with their trauma-informed school policies and practices. And have the outcomes to show that it's effective in terms of exclusionary discipline and office referrals and all of those kinds of things. So every year, it is our attempt to infuse these dollars in innovative projects that are both in rural and urban communities and in a variety of settings. So Dia asked that I kind of talk a little bit about some of the policies that have emerged as a result of Building Strong Brains and understanding trauma and adverse childhood experiences. And I'm going to give a quick example of each one at every level. So at the statewide level, we have had several pieces of legislation introduced, but also a few that have passed, referencing adverse childhood experiences and trauma. A lot of it at this point has to do with trauma-informed education and ensuring that we consider the impact of trauma when in our discipline strategies of youth, which is great. So we can think about that happening, at that top tier, so to speak, in terms of affecting everyone. But here we have our public and private sector partners. So this is where our state agencies show up, and our Rotary clubs and our insurers. They are at this table and they're learning all of this, and they are also changing their policies. So an example of this would be the Department of Human Services. They put it in their licensing requirements that all licensed childcare facilities have to have training on ACEs every 5 years in order to maintain their licensing, right? Because it's so important that these folks understand this information. Also, our Department of Education has embarked on supporting trauma-informed schools across the state, in large part because of the success that has happened in Nashville. And then some examples at the local level is we are starting to see, including in Nashville, changes in local organizations, local policies as a result of this knowledge. And all three of these areas work in a synchronous way to improve the health and well-being of kids and the people who serve them in our state. So when we think specifically, and Dia, I know I'm at like 20 minutes here, I'm sorry, but I'm almost done. When we think specifically about trauma-informed policing and the way in which this intersects, what is exciting is that there are many communities across the state who are engaging this trauma-informed policing effort, including some here in Tennessee. The Johnson City Police Department has really gained national recognition for their work in this area. So it's nice to see local voices represented at this table. And there are lots of things that we could say about trauma-informed policing, but the most important is now that you know why you're seeing the behaviors that you see, that more often than not, they are a result of trauma, then you begin to understand how you most appropriately respond to those behaviors. So I pulled some of these from the Vera Institute. And again, I'm not going to read through it all, but when you're looking at certain symptoms, a lot of times, especially in a very tense situation, they are misread as aggressive behaviors or not caring about what's going on, no respect, those kinds of things. When in reality, we have a person who is triggered or who is experiencing fight, flight, freeze. And the worst thing we can do is match fire with fire, right? Because that escalates the whole situation. So when police officers, teachers, whoever are working with these individuals and understand what these behaviors really are communicating, that somebody's very stressed out, that they're not in their logical mind, that they're in their reactive emotional mind, then we can change the way that we react, right? And we can be calm and understand that it's not personal, right? And this person isn't a bad person. This is a hurt person. And so when we see these sorts of things, we can be calm in our interactions and de-escalate things and honestly build trust between citizens who are most vulnerable and most traumatized and the individuals in our society who are trying to protect them, right? I do have a very quick anecdotal story that Chief Roddy shared in that Training for Trainers event that he had already begun to understand the impact of trauma before showing up that day. And he said, I've pulled people over. And at first, because of their history, their decades of negative interaction with police, they are like this when I've pulled them over and I come up to their window. And what he says is that he changes the way that he interacts with them in an empathetic way and says things like, hey man, I noticed you were speeding. And, unfortunately, I want to make sure, first of all, is there anything wrong, right? Like checking in with them to make sure that there's not an emergency, those sorts of things. And if there's nothing wrong, or sometimes even if there is, his response is, I hate to do this, but I have to make sure that, I keep other people safe and keep you safe. And so I'm going to have to give you this ticket, but I want you to drive safely home. I care about you. And that sort of interaction changes the whole dynamic. And he said that he actually has people thanking him right after they've gotten their ticket. Thank you, Chief Roddy. And it's building a whole new rapport and trust between folks that needs to be continued. So our conclusion is we want to move from this position of what's wrong with this child or this adult or this family or this community, right, to what has happened to this person and how can I wrap services and supports around them, assume the best and not assume the worst, and really engage in a radically different way that is holistic and healing. So with that, I'm sorry I went over about like 6 minutes, Dia, but I'm going to shut up.
Jen, that was terrific. And we're going to turn to Judge Sheila Calloway now for her presentation. And as she loads her slides and gets the presentation ball, Judge Calloway will present on her implementation of trauma-informed approaches in her court. So this is a perfect segue. Take it away, Judge Calloway.
Thanks, Dia. And for those who know me or don't know me well, I don't talk a lot, and so I don't necessarily need the whole 15 minutes. I'm glad I can see Dia laugh. Okay.
We know that's not true.
Hey,
I've known Judge Calloway since 1987. I can attest to the fact that that's not true.
Okay, there's way too many of you that know me. I'm sorry. Good to see you, Amanda. All right, so as you all know, in my bio and everything, that I became the juvenile court judge in 2014. I had worked in juvenile court many, many years before that, and had seen just our response and our approach to our youth, even our families, our parents that came into the court system, and we were a system that was, about rules. We make these rules, you follow the rules. If you don't follow the rules, there's consequences that you pay. And we weren't really getting much movement on the number of kids that were getting in trouble, the number of parents that were losing their children. And it just was a constant turn. And so when I campaigned and when I decided I was going to run, I decided we had to do things differently. And so, similar to the 4 Ps that were used, we have the 3 Ps that I campaigned on as a platform for the way we would treat the children and families that come into the court. That we were to prevent problems from happening, that our goal was not just to wait until a child got in trouble and punish them for the trouble that they got in, but to actually look further into it, look why that child got in trouble, what's going on, or even to prevent children and come get in trouble, working with the school system, working with the police department on figuring out ways to prevent children from escalating and becoming more into the system. My goal was to promote the positive potential of everyone that came into the building. And because I know, as Jen kind of talked about, we're all born with these potentials to do great things. And it's the things that happen to us between 0 and 3 that determine where you're going. And so I know that we have the ability as a court system to promote that positive potential of everybody that comes into the courtroom. And a lot of people, when they think about court, saw it as a very punitive place, a place that they absolutely were not going to be treated fairly, that they had no hope of getting anything done, no hope in themselves, no hope in the system. And so that was some of the things that I had to change. But what I recognized as becoming the judge, that I could not make those changes just for the children and families that we serve if I wasn't doing the same thing for our employees. So I had to step back and say, you know what, I can tell them all day about what it means to be trauma informed. I can tell them all day about what it means to lay down these foundations. But if I'm not doing it for my staff, and I'm not doing it for the people that work with the people that are going through trauma, and knowing that our staff is going through all kind of trauma as well, then I'm doing a disservice. And so these 3 Ps are not just for the children and family that we serve, it's for our entire staff. And so that's the foundation that we had to start with. And so, we said we got to do it brick by brick. And what that means is we've got to stop from step 1. And so the first thing that we did as an administration was we worked to align our current staff members' roles with what their strengths and their passions were. So we would have people that came into the court system and wanted to work with parents, but we would, because we categorize your job as a probation officer, you can only work with the youth that came in, or you can only work with certain things. I love to talk about Jessica Robertson's story. She has a background in human resources, and she always was a probation officer that was stuck in a courtroom doing basically paperwork on family services cases and making sure that things got assigned and attorneys got assigned, and she wasn't really using her skills. So now she's our head of our students training attorneys and resource team, and she is absolutely knocking out of the box. She loves her job. She does a great job at it. She does all the training for our staff, make sure that everybody gets trained. She helps to do all our internships, and fits her job and fits who she is and fits her passions. And so now we see her excelling in her job. She's just one example. There's so many examples that we have, but we had to align all of our staff in order to get them to the point where they were comfortable in their job. And that meant to, start with having fair and transparent hiring and promotion practices. It used to be, if you were there forever and no matter what kind of job you did, you get a promotion because that's the way it was. And literally, we had people who were on a grade of PO1 for almost their entire life. And you can only get to the PO2 position if someone died or retired or just decide to quit, which never ever happened. There were like only a very small number of PO2 positions. And so there was no effort or no real ability to be better unless you were, being very competitive and trying to knock down everybody else around you so that you could get that next PO2 spot. And we recognized that wasn't healthy as an organization. So we had to do some changes on that. And so we wanted to maximize the pay under all the applicable guidelines. And so we're making sure that everybody gets promotions and raises on a regular basis. And we also created more opportunities for advancements. And so you can get to a PO2 without having to wait for someone to die to do that. We have a staff of about 125 people. Of those staff, probably about a fourth of them are grant funded positions. And so they don't have the same civil service protections, but we made it clear by policy that we would give them the same protections, even though they are a grant. And so people aren't, afraid to be on a grant in our courthouse and say, oh, I could get fired any day for no reason. They actually are given the same civil service protections as well. We do fair employment policies on leave and work conditions. We work with people if they have to leave early because of childcare issues. That's something that we're going to work out with them. And when there's conflicts and discipline issues within the department, we make sure that it's fair and that we're treating everybody the same and that no one gets a one-up on anybody else. We also do a lot of support of our employees in their personal situations. If they have housing issues or family crises or health issues, we want them to be comfortable to come to us, come to their supervisors in order for us to, as we do all of our clients, to bring stuff together to help them the same way we would help any of our clients that come into the building. We encourage positive and encouraging attitude with accommodations. And so we've had a number of disabled employees in the past, some that had sight issues, some that have hearing issues. And we're making sure that we have equipment so that they can type or they can hear. And we have an attorney that works with us that is having hearing issues now. And so we all have masks that have windows in them so that she can see our lips and not have to struggle to get through a court hearing. And so those things that we do very consciously to make sure that we're taking care of all of our people that come into the building. We encourage on a regular people to participate in the employee assistance program that's offered by Metro. We are in a high stress job. We have kids that die. We have families that are, ripped in the middle of the night from each other. We live that trauma, and it's secondhand trauma, and we go through it. And so we encourage all of our employees to take advantage of the employee assistance program. And it's not about taking time, taking your own personal time, but we think that's part of the job, that it's self-care, and that if you need to go and the only time the person can see you is at 1 o'clock, take your time at 1 o'clock. And so those are some of the things that we continue to do in order to build our staff up. We have a lot of team building activities. I encourage them to go out and be a part of their teams and do fun group activities. We do a newsletter, a monthly newsletter where I recognize people who've done just things that are just a little above and beyond what their job. We do staff recognitions. We do, if you have a child that's graduated or going back to school, we do all those things that we can as part of our newsletter in recognition of our staff. And we also have dedicated celebrations and court-wide projects. We haven't had as many since March, but usually we have like an annual spring fling where out of my pocket, I pay for our court staff to just have a afternoon where they have free food and music and games so that they can relax. It's a staff appreciation time. Every year we do a spectacular for the kids in the community, and our staff enjoy it so much more than the kids. We're on hold now if we're going to be able to have it this year. We know it's going to be, if we do, it's going to be a drive-through spectacular, not a come into the courthouse. But it's still going to be an opportunity for the staff to just have fun, dress up, social distance, and we're not passing out candy or anything. Just in order at a time to have fun. And we started doing a Veterans Day commemoration every year as well, where we recognize we have a number of at least about 20 vets that work in our courthouse, and so we recognize them. So some of those are things that we do to encourage just an opportunity to get away from some of the trauma and to relax and enjoy. We also understand that training is absolutely important. And all of our employees are required to do all of the trainings that are listed, the ACEs, trauma, motivational interviewing. We've done at least 2 poverty simulations with the entire staff. The power of calm training, implicit bias, LGBTQ and support training. We work with the Oasis Center, and they have trained each and every one of us a couple of times on LGBTQ issues. We always train on secondary traumatic stress and compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, because that's what we deal with on a regular basis. And we always talk about self-care strategies and principles of effective intervention and cognitive interaction skills. These are trainings that are ongoing. And it's not a one-time check a box, yes, we did ACEs training. It's an ongoing training that we know is important that our staff have on a regular basis. And so we offer them on several different occasions, different times. We try to do some of them, a lot of them together, like the poverty simulation, just things that will help our staff stay connected to who they are, what they're going through, what their trauma is about, as well as what the people that we're working with and the families that we're trying to help. We're making sure that we select the right people that are trauma informed and that are going to add to the staff at our court, that they have emotional intelligence, that they understand the traumatic natures of our job and the importance of self-care. We have, half of our staff go into the homes of the people that we serve. And a lot of times they go in and they see trauma, and learning how to deal with that and to not take everything home with you, and to be able to keep moving on. Watch your Young and the Restless every night, or your Housewives, your Housewives show. Jen, I can't think of the name of it, but those kind of things that we're making sure that people understand that when we're hiring them at the beginning, that they're mature and they're open and they're affirming, that they have compassion and empathy, combined with good boundaries. And we have sometimes we'll have to bring people back, and when they have taken on the entire family's whole trauma as part of their life, and we have to make sure that our staff understands the boundaries that you have to make as you're working with children and families that are going through some type of traumas. And just to make sure that people understand when we hire them, the backgrounds of our children and families. We ask questions about brain science and what they know about brain science. It doesn't matter if they're coming in as a person who does paralegal stuff or intake stuff, to our warrant officers, to our probation officers. We want to make sure that everybody that walks in the building has a good background information about brain science, about how families work together, about understanding ACEs and trauma, and all those things that we work with. And so those are things that we've done. We partnered with the Family Center to build a trauma-informed court. And our vision of the trauma-informed court is a trauma-informed juvenile court that identifies individuals who experience trauma, ensures the provision of appropriate intervention and services, and improves the health and well-being of youth, family, staff, and the Nashville community. We know that if we're able to build the trauma, have a trauma-informed court that can build up the health of the people that come into our building, we know that it's gonna spread into the Nashville community, and so that's what our goals are. Working with the Family Center, we did a fostering resilience committee that began in 2018. It was about 14 of our staff members from every department of our building. We also had some outside collaborators that came and worked with them as well. They meet about twice a month for about 2 hours. Their vision statement is listed, and the mission is listed as well, that we're going to create a more positive, results-oriented community. And it's about building the community, not just juvenile court, but by building our community, by empowering our juvenile justice staff to be able to provide trauma-informed support and services. They learned about compassion fatigue, burnout, vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, and the committee was designed and implemented a wellness assessment that we give to our staff. And so as part of our staff, you have to take a wellness assessment to see where you are and how you are on the scale. We in the packet that I sent, the information that you got from us, we just have implemented our policy on being a trauma-informed court. And so you actually see the things that it's not just us talking about it, us thinking about it, it's us actually making it a policy of the court that we are to be trauma-informed and what that means and what we expect. We're working on developing an action plan to address the needs from the assessments that we've done. We want to make sure our full staff is supporting and carrying out, and that we're communicating what we're doing on a regular basis, which means that I sometimes struggle with this. I have to be open for feedback and suggestions from all the staff, and my administrators have to do the same. We just recently had a big talk with some of the probation officers about when we started, how we were so in tune with being trauma-informed for our clients that we weren't thinking about our staff, and we had to go back and kind of heal some wounds that we did early on, when our emphasis was just on our clients and staff, and our clients and not necessarily our staff. And so those are things that we have to do to be more trauma-informed. And we got to be able to have difficult conversations. So we had a very recent virtual training about race relations, and it was hard. There were some people who were hurt by some of the things that we're saying, but we had, in order to work with the entire population, we have to be able to have those honest and hard conversations. Some of the struggles that we had are, building trust with our staff members. We've had staff members that have been there for ages, and they're going through this is just another administration. This too shall pass, but this is something that I hope that will stick, and making policies and things. And so it took some time to be able to build trust with our staff members, and some we're still working on. And even though I might think that I'm communicating the big picture to the whole staff, sometimes there's some staff that are like, why are we doing this again? Why are we doing all this training? What's this about? And so it's about, we have struggles with making sure that we're still communicating the big picture to everybody. My biggest struggle is the public's misunderstanding of what it means to be a trauma-informed court. And I hear and I see and I read some of the comments. Oh, another kid got in trouble. I guess Judge Calloway is going to give him cookies and milk. And that's not what it's about. That's not what it's about at all. And people have to understand that. And I've got to do a better job of communicating what it means to be trauma-informed, and communicating what it means to have the entire staff trauma-informed, working with our clients, our children, our families that are trauma-informed. It means talking about, not what did you do, but what happened to you, and learning about where the trauma comes from, where, the issues are coming from. And so communicating that to the community is something that is a challenge that I have, and that I continuously try to work on. I always want to involve my staff in being part of the decision making. I think that helps us to be more trauma informed, but you got to do it in a way that is timely, that we can still get the work done that we got to get done. And we've had a lot of hiccups during the COVID period. I think I'm just trying to figure out how to run court and keep everybody safe. and do the things that we've got to do to keep our services going, making sure our families and their children are taken care of, but yet making sure our staff is taken care of. And so those are things that, I try to include as many people as part of the decision making, but sometimes it's a little difficult. And I think people probably know, and my biggest issue, one thing is we have a horribly built building that has a lot of issues, and a lot of the issues are coming out now with sewage issues, pipe issues, and there's nowhere where you can have private conversations with your clients, with your with the probation officers can't go anywhere to have a conversation with whoever's coming in. Attorneys can't talk to their clients without having a big audience in a whole courthouse. And so we have a non-trauma informed building. And so it's my goal to, at some point, be able to have a trauma informed building that has safe places in the building, that has soft rooms, that has meeting spaces, that has de-escalation rooms, and things like that. We don't have that now, and that's something that is on my wish list to do. When I think about communicating to the public about the benefits and the successes that we have in becoming more trauma informed, the biggest success is juvenile crime is down. Despite what you might hear on the news or anything else, juvenile crime is down. I think the stats are from the end of July of 2020. Juvenile crime was down 63% from 2013, 63%. And these are arrest data that we get from the Metro Police. From January, it was June 20, from January 1st of 2013 to June 29th of 2013, there were 2,503 juvenile arrests. That same period, in January 2020 to July 2020, there were 932 juvenile arrests. So we really are making a difference in the community by decreasing the number of juvenile crimes. But we don't do a good job of advertising that, and we don't do a good job of telling people that. But our youth and our families are responding to having a more trauma-informed court. And this is also some stats from what we do when we divert our cases from the juvenile justice system. So we've diverted in 2017, 2,446 cases, which means, there was a complaint about a child, and we handled it in a different way versus sending them to court. We may have sent them to some of our, and you can read this in the packet of stuff, information that I sent, but we'll send them to our DP3 program partners and have the community be a part of getting that child back on the right track. And so in those 2017, 2018, of the over 2,000 cases that we've diverted from the actual prosecution of the criminal system, only 6% of those youth had come back in a 2-year period for a new delinquent offense, and only 4% of those were felonies. That is amazing. That is an amazing recidivism rate, and it shows what we can do when we are more trauma informed and more worried about what has happened to everybody, not just the children and families, but the staff as well. So I think, Thea, that might be it. I like to always end with a nice little quote from James Baldwin, who says, "For these are all our children. We will all profit by or pay for whatever they become." And so I want to profit by our kids. I want to do right by our kids. And that means that we got to be trauma informed, that we got to worry about what has happened to everybody that's part of their system, everybody that's talking to them, everybody that's interacting with them. That we all have to understand what trauma is, and that we've got to be informed, and that we've got to do services that are in order to make sure that we're addressing all of that. All right, Dee, I'm done.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you, Judge Calloway. We so appreciate that. I mean, I think this is really at the heart of, the challenges before the commission, and I think you really shed a light on what we can be thinking about. So with that, thank you so much for your presentation and for that fabulous quote from James Baldwin. And thank you, Jen. I'd like to open the floor to questions. This brown bag is scheduled to 1:15, so we're going to keep the recording rolling and keep questions coming in till 1:15. So I will, I'm scrolling, or if you'd like to unmute, if you have a specific question, please feel free to go ahead. I don't see any hands raised yet. I see Amanda Lucas's actual hand raised. Please step forward.
Thank you so much, Dia, and thank you so much, excuse me, Ms. Drake Croft and Judge Calloway for those presentations and all that both of you do for our community. And I have to say, Judge Calloway, I worked at juvenile court for 6 years. I was one of those caseworkers who is in our clients' homes every day. And just everything you shared just brought tears to my eyes because I advocated for almost all of those things when I was there. And so it's thrilling to hear that you've moved there. This is more of a question or a comment than a question based on everything that Ms. Drake Croft said, which was right on. I am a social worker. I'm a psychotherapist. I specialize in trauma. And I also spent 20 years in the community, both as a juvenile court caseworker, as a community mental health worker, is that I really want us to focus on something Ms. Drake Croft said, which is that, yes, there is absolutely abuse and neglect and trauma that occurs for children. But in my experience, those other, I think you said adverse community experiences, I'm sure what that was, that is a really important piece that we have to keep in mind and something that I hope that we include in whatever training we expand for police and other individuals, is that going to the brain-based education, is that nutrition affects how children's brains are built and the process of myelination, the sheathing of the brain. And that can be interrupted by living in a food desert, not having access to fresh food. I remember when I worked in community mental health, just trying to bring those mobile food trucks in. Pollution is a huge issue for especially poor communities and communities of color, where it's as responsible for diabetes and heart disease as diet is pollution. So it's not to say that we're going to be able to fix all of these things, but we have to stop looking at this as problems within the family, that the children don't have, you know, a lot of these children have very loving parents who want to do right by them. They don't have the resources. And even something to the extent of absentee landlords in this city has been a huge issue. Children living in unsafe environments, like I believe Jen mentioned, you know, unsafe drinking water and having mold and other contaminants that give them asthma, which keeps them out of school, which puts them at greater risk of arrest. So I really want us to continue to look at, you know, I know Jen's a social worker as well, those macro systems that affect these children and how we can intervene in those systems and not just with the children and families. And so bringing support around how can we make these systems more humane. Everything that Judge Calloway has done has made that system so much more humane for these children and their families, so that they feel like they're not being judged and punished, but supported and helped to access the things that they need. But I just wanted to really emphasize that piece of what they've already shared, because that is so, from my experience doing that work, and as someone who specializes in trauma now as a psychotherapist, that is a really big part of being trauma informed. So thank you guys so much.
Madam Chair, this is Gary Moore. I'm on my phone, so you can't see my hand raised.
Well, thank you, Mr. Moore, for jumping right in. Please go ahead with your question.
Thank you. First will be to Judge Calloway. You mentioned the decline in arrest, and did I hear you correctly? And you're attributing that because of the being trauma informed. Is that, you think, was the overall reason for the decline?
I think that definitely was a part of it. And we've done a lot of good collaborations with the school system as well as the police department We looked early on about where most of the referrals or the arrests were coming from, and a lot of them were coming from the school system. And so we worked hand in hand with the schools, with the SROs, about how can we make a difference. And a lot of times there were a lot of arrests for things that were discipline issues that should not have been arrests. And a lot of them were, to go back into my other role with Dia, were a lot of mental health issues as well. I'll give an example. We had a elementary school who had I think she was a fourth grader, and she literally was having a mental health breakdown where she stripped out of her clothes in the middle of class, and she started defecating in the middle of the class, and then she was picking it up and throwing it. Now, as the teacher, I'm going to be panicked. And, that's not something that you sign up to be a teacher to have to handle. And so I think the teacher did the best that they could. When teacher was able to get everybody out of the room, kind of keep her in the room by herself, contact the principal or whoever, and, try to figure out a plan from there. And so their only plan was originally to call a mobile crisis. And at the time, before we had a collaboration meeting, mobile crisis was, there were two questions that they asked: is she suicidal or is she homicidal? Well, no, she's just throwing some shit around the room, literally. And so the mobile crisis couldn't come to that place to try and give any assistance. And so they did the only thing that they could after that was they called the police. And so in the police, when they get called, they're like, well, we don't know what we're doing. That's not a situation that we need to be calling the police for. We need to call a crisis intervention team for that, or something like that, but not the police, because their only answer is, well, okay, technically, yes, she's being disorderly, so we'll have to arrest her. And so they bring a fourth grader to juvenile court on a clear mental health issue. And so it's not something that we're going to hold her in detention, but the trauma that the girl was already going through, on top of additional trauma of an arrest in front of all her schoolmates, feeling unsafe in the school system, how's she going to feel when it's time for her to go back to that school? The school that when she was going through the worst time of her life, probably, and their only response was to have her arrested. And so, we sat down and talked to the SROs, talked to the police department, talked to mobile crisis, and said, we got to do better. And so based on that, there was, from when Dr. Joseph was the director, there was a moratorium on arrests of elementary students. And literally in 1 year, it went down 73% arrests of elementary students. It's unfortunate there's like 15 that still got arrested. And, we're working on that number and looking at those cases and see, if there's an alternative. But the fact that we were able to get it down by that much in 1 year, and it was a collaboration between all of us, which made a difference. The police are partnering us with us and with the Department of Children's Services, particularly the juvenile task force, as well as I can't think of the other name of the other one we work with hand in hand. We work with them all the time, and you can't think of their name. But anyhow, we work with them on a lot of preventive stuff, like we do. We work with them with their, it's not a family retreat. If you hadn't asked me these questions, I'd have these names on top of my head. But they do a family retreat kind of thing where they, instead of prosecuting some of the smaller cases, they have the family go through a treatment program that's run by the Metropolitan, and they have us come out and speak to the families and stuff and participate in the graduation. That has decreased some of the numbers of kids that are getting arrested. So there are a lot of things that go into it, but I definitely think that being trauma informed for my staff, working with the school system and the police department, and being able to have conversations about what it means to be trauma informed, about let's not just arrest this kid because he had a breakdown. Let's think about why he had it and what we can do to help. I think all of those things together have greatly helped to decrease the number of kids that are getting arrested.
Thank you very much. I also have a question, Madam Chair, for the other panelists, and that is, you give one example of how being trauma informed has helped a police officer on the street. Do you have more examples of that? Because I think this primary function of this committee is to look at how we can revamp the police department to do a better job out in the community, and that certainly hits home there. That the police officer on the street that have had this training, how it actually helps them on the street to stabilize the situation.
Absolutely. So I want to take the time to quickly say everything that Judge Calloway just highlighted is also a trauma-informed approach, right? Collaborating with different institutions and organizations to create more effective solutions and understand the basis for the behaviors you're seeing and how do we prevent them is absolutely trauma-informed. And so when we think about trauma-informed policing, it's the same as a trauma-informed juvenile court or trauma-informed schools. We are not asking teachers or police officers to be all things, to be therapists and police officers, right? And teachers or what have you, right? And so with that, I'm going to answer your question, which is when we look at Johnson City Police Department and even other police departments across the nation, when these officers begin to recognize that a lot of what they're seeing is mental health related, is related to homelessness, is a result of trauma, right? And oftentimes trauma from previous interactions with police. That what you hear over and over and over again, and Chief Roddy's example is just one of them, is that they are approaching that with an openness and a gentleness and non-judgmental attitude, if that makes sense, where they're saying, wow, this person is really having a mental health breakdown, right? Instead of as Judge Calloway said, this person's being disorderly, right? And then that mindset shift leads to very different actions. If you think somebody's being disorderly, you arrest them, you book them, you put them in jail. If you think that, or if you take the perception that somebody is having a mental health breakdown, because what she described with that fourth grader are events that happen with adults all the time in communities. And so it is, how do we partner with our mental health providers, right, to come alongside us and support this individual? And so what you see is, this is kind of a long answer to your question. Many of these police departments are not only understanding the impact of trauma, right, and techniques to de-escalate and why you would take those techniques and what these behaviors are actually showing you, and then consequently see decreased negative interactions with the citizens that they're serving, right? But also you see that there are these increased partnerships, there are reduced recidivism. I do want to bring it here locally to Metro Davidson County Sheriff's Office, where before they even knew the words trauma-informed, which they're involved and invested in a very similar way as Judge Calloway, that they had a trauma-informed approach, right? Like it came from their experience and their wisdom, where Sheriff Hall had this mantra that the police arrest the person, we arrest the problem, right? And that a huge piece of reducing recidivism was bringing in the community and fostering those connections, as well as employing a lot of those evidence-based assessment approaches, et cetera, so that when people were released from jail, that they had a community, an individual, an organization to connect with, to support them, right, and help them heal. So that is a sort of a vague example of what you see, but increasingly what you'll see is a really changed approach in the interpersonal engagement, where it's calm, where it's supportive, where it's not taking it personally, and then you see a changed approach and what happens next. So did that answer your question? I hope it did.
Yes, ma'am. It's kind of around the park to get it, but we got it. Thank you.
Also, yeah, that is my style. I have to give all the context.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Gary Moore. I see that Russ Pulley has his electronic hand raised, so go ahead.
Thank you. I've learned long ago to be careful what I ask Judge Callaway, because she's a powerful figure around the courthouse, and we've got an awful lot of respect for her and what she does. So I tend to tread lightly around this, but I'm gonna tread in here anyway, Judge Callaway. But before I do this, I want to comment on both of the presentations. They were very good, and as a former police officer, I understand that we are charged with a responsibility to deal with an awful lot out there. And these kinds of skill sets passed along to the police are very, very important. I look at some of the recent experiences that we've seen nationally. I've seen some of these videos, and I'm thinking, wow, if we only really understood how to handle some of these better from a de-escalation standpoint, the outcomes would be so much different. So the only question I would have for you, Judge, is you mentioned the data point about the reduction of juvenile arrests. Ultimately, an additional data point that would be very helpful when I look at is examining that with its effect on public safety in general. So to reduce arrests of juveniles is a good thing, and it's a good thing, and it's an impactful thing. And I certainly learned an awful lot from Bill Barnes about the effects of what you call the ACEs, or the pathology of some of these things to which children are exposed. And I learned more from him than anybody on that, and how traumatic this is on kids. So I'm certainly sympathetic to all that. On the other side of the argument is, we've experienced some things in my district, for example, where we've seen some a couple of years ago a very serious spike in violent crimes, and it was ultimately attributed to juvenile groups. So my question is more centered around reducing arrests is one thing. How does that reduction, is there a data point for how that reduction impacts public safety? Does it reduce the crimes for which juveniles have been attributed, or is it somehow negatively impact that data? Does that make sense?
It does. And I know I only have like 3 minutes to answer. I'll try to do it as quick as I can. Overall,
you can't do this in 3 minutes. I know you too well.
I'm gonna try.
Okay.
But I actually was trying to pull up a different slide that I have. Unfortunately, I can't get to it. But overall, juvenile crime is down in every category except for car thefts and handgun possessions. Those are the two categories where juvenile crime is up. So the homicide rate it's down, but not by much. It's something that we're working on. Now, when I say the homicide rate, there's probably no more than about 10 in the last couple of years. Each year, no more than 10 homicides. And aggravated robberies are about the same as well. They might be down a little, but overall, violent crimes are down, except for car thefts and handgun possession. And what we're discovering is what juveniles are doing is they're going to parking lots or neighborhoods and they're trying car door handles. And they find one that's open. They're like, ooh, we got gold. They open it, they get in it. And a lot of times there are handguns that are in the cars. And so it's kind of like, it's unfortunate. It's kind of like a game to them of how many cars and guns they can find in a single, night or period. And they go in groups to do this. We've got to do a better job as both adults and our community on parking safe and keeping handguns with you, not in your cars, and those kind of things. We got to make it where it's not fun for kids to steal cars. But those are the most serious cases that we're having now, and that trend is definitely going up.
My constituents don't want to hear this, but as long as I keep getting reports from the police department monthly where the number is usually around 70% of car break-ins are when people leave their cars unlocked or leave something attractive in there, they're going to keep hearing park smart. And until you do that, those numbers are going to be high. Thank you very much for that explanation. I appreciate you very much.
And I did it in 2 minutes.
Man, that's what I'm going to record right there. That's the most impressive part of that performance.
And I can send to Dia, who can send out some more stats about the total number of violent crimes. I just didn't put it in this stat.
Thanks very much. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Well, we are right at 1:14, and I just want to thank both panelists for sharing their time with us today on this really compelling topic of trauma-informed law enforcement and what that looks like. And I'll tell you what, I'm going to take this one more minute, and I'm just going to say, Jen and Judge Callaway, any thoughts on trauma-informed policing in Nashville?
I was going to let Judge answer first.
So for me, I think it's a number one goal that we have to have for our policing in Nashville, and it can't be a check the box training. I myself sometimes find myself slipping back into punitive thoughts like, oh, I can't believe this kid's back here again. I'm going to lock him up for as long as I can. I do that on a regular basis. And it's something that I have to make sure that I'm constantly being reminded and getting trained about trauma and how it affects someone's brain. So it can't be a one-time training for cadets. It has to be a overall part of the police department that every person from top to bottom gets full train on it on a regular basis.
Yeah, I would say one thing, and it really complements Judge's comments, is that you need coaching and support, because changing from what you've always done, especially in a job as difficult as policing, requires coaching and support. However, I know that Judge will attest to this, and the people who have begun to do trauma-informed, justice can attest to this. It's worth it. When you put in the effort to change the culture, and when you support your staff and understand the trauma they're going through, ultimately it's not only improving your outcomes related to your mission, it is improving the quality of life for your staff who got into this to protect people and feel often hopeless as things continue to explode and they continue to experience secondary trauma. And so it's worth the effort, is what I'm trying to say.
You both have been wonderful. So what we hear from you is it's good. It will be good for the police, and it will be good for our communities. And so with that note, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for sharing your afternoons with us. Take care. Bye-bye.